Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Wait, I see live. Are we live?
Yeah, we're live.
Okay, okay. Just checking technical stuff. Um, Again, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. We're just gonna jump into our roll call. As always, we will go community by
But they're
community
actually
board.
now doing the process of ensuring.
Okay. Sometimes technology fails us a little bit in this 21st century, but we're back on track. Um, so what we'll do is as usual, go community board by community board. Please unmute yourself in advance of your community board if you can, and then be ready to respond as I call your community board. And to do so, if you're on the phone, it would be star 9. Yeah, no, that's to raise your hand. Star 6. Star 6 is to unmute yourself and mute yourself back. Star 9 is to raise your hand and unraise your hand. So, getting started, of course, we're starting with Community Board 1.
Can't hear him. Cedric Lofton, we're Community Board 1.
Oh, okay. We're getting to a slow start, but we're gonna get the engines going any moment now. Community Board 2.
Good morning, Madam Deputy. Ralph Acevedo, Bronx Community Board 2.
Okay, I want everyone to take a lesson. That's what I want. I want that kind of enthusiasm. Community Board 3.
Yeah, good morning, Madam Deputy. John Dudley, District Manager, Board 3 here.
All right, very good. Community Board 4.
Good morning, Madam Deputy.
This Community Board 4.
Sorry, we were talking at the same time. See all that enthusiasm? So that was the chair, Robert Garmendez. This is Paul Phillips, District Manager from Community Board 4.
Thank you both. Thank you both for the energy. Community Board 5.
Good morning, Madam Deputy. I'm here, Dr. Bora, Chair, Board 5.
And good morning, Dr. Bola, Madam Deputy. This is Ken Brown. I'm still the District Manager for Bronx Community Board 5.
Community Board 6. Okay, Community Board 7.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Madam Deputy. Community Board 7 is here.
Good morning. Community Board 8.
Good morning and happy Thursday. Spalter, Community Board 8 Chair.
Thank you so much. That's our new role model right there for Community Board 9.
Good morning, Madam Deputy and everyone logged in. This is Shirley San Andres Alonso, Assistant District Manager.
I like this Bronx competition right here. I see what's happening. Community Board 10.
Joseph Russo here, Chair for Community Board 10.
Thank you. Community Board 11.
Sorry.
Guten Morgen. Das ist Jeremy Warnicki, District Manager, Community Board 11.
Thank you for taking us international. Community Board 12.
Good morning, Madam Deputy. This is Dr. Michael Burke, Chair, Community Board 12.
Good morning. This is George from Community Board 12.
Good morning, George. Our council members, representatives, Council Member Ayala's office.
Jose
Okay.
Rodriguez, Chief of Staff for Councilman Ayala, is having technical difficulties.
Okay. Thank you very much. Council Member Denowitz. I stumbled because I want to say Assembly Member, but it's Council Member Denowitz.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Sabrina Campbell. I'm the Constituent Services Advocate in the Office of Councilmember Eric Dinowitz.
Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
And Councilmember Riley. Okay, Councilmember Joing. Councilmember Cabrera.
Good morning, Deputy Greg Faulkner, representing Councilman Cabrera.
Thank you so much. Councilmember Felix. Councilmember Gibson.
Good morning, everybody. Reshma Hariprasad from Councilmember Vanessa Gibson's office. Hi.
Hi, awesome. Thank you for being here. And Councilmember Salamanca. And last but not least, Councilmember Ruben Diaz Sr. All righty, that was our roll call. Thank you for thank you for the enthusiasm. So let's jump right into our agenda. Pursuant to Chapter 4, Section 85 and Chapter 69, Section 2706 of the New York City Charter, a joint meeting of the Bronx Borough Service Cabinet and Bronx Borough Board will take place here virtually Thursday, April 22nd, 2021, starting at 10 a.m. And again, we will just proceed with the agenda. We'll start with an overview of Open Street Initiative, and we'll have a presentation from the New York City Department of Transportation and friend to the Bronx Borough Commissioner, Alvaro Lopez.
Good morning, Madam Deputy, and good morning, Community Board and Council members. It's good to see you all. I'm still hopeful that we'll be able to do this in person someday, soon. But
someday, let's just say someday.
Yeah. Well, hope springs eternal for me. But I'm here today with my colleagues, Kyle Gorman from our DOT's Public Space Unit, and also Dorisa Cruz, Bronx Borough Planner, to talk about our Open Streets Initiative. As many of you all remember, this first began last year, just about around a year ago during the height of the pandemic. And this past February, when Mayor de Blasio announced the appointment of Hank Gutman as new DOT commissioner, he also in that announcement said that he wanted to work towards making the Open Streets a permanent program in New York City. So we want to give you a presentation of what that means. So I'm going to turn it over now to Kyle. He's going to sort of walk you through the presentation, and then we're going to stay on to answer questions regarding the new program, or the updated program, I should say. So Kyle, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Navarro, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm Kyle Gorman. I work in the DOT's Public Space Unit, and I have the unique opportunity of managing the Open Streets program here in New York City. So I'm going to just briefly go through a presentation that we put together that lays out how the Open Streets program is evolving in 2021, and just give more information to you all about how to apply for Open Streets. So I'm going to share my screen now. Give it just 1 second to pull up. Let me make it full screen. Everyone should be able to see my screen now. So I'm sharing the deck, and let's jump right on in. So at the base level, open streets are corridors that are designated to prioritize pedestrians and cyclists. And when a street is designated as an open street, it really allows for a whole slew of different types of activities and opportunities to exist to really support the city as it recovers from this devastating pandemic, help businesses sort of thrive during this time, and really give New Yorkers a safe place to gather when other types of public places have been closed over the last year. Some of you on the line today might be familiar with the Weekend Walks or Seasonal Streets program. Moving forward, our plan is to take all of the great things that we had as a part of Weekend Walks and Seasonal Streets and to take, of course, everything that we've learned, especially over the last year with open streets, and just move forward with everything being merged into this new NYC Open Streets program. So I'm going to first touch on the two different types of open streets. So we have a little bit of background as to how the program sort of works from an operational perspective. So there are two types. The first is the temporary limited local access open street, and the second type is the temporary full closure open street. So I'll first touch on the temporary limited local access open street. So these are streets that are designated for pedestrian and cyclist use, but there is still some limited vehicle access that is permitted. Cars that are only doing the following items listed on the screen can access these blocks because the desire for us is to really have them being predominantly used by pedestrians and cyclists. But if you are a driver, you can access the street if you need to park. Of course, all regulations still apply. Picking up and dropping off passengers, family members, friends, deliveries. We want to, of course, make sure that business as usual activities can occur seamlessly. Assess a ride for any New Yorker that relies on this service. City and utility service vehicles are also permitted, so garbage trucks, Con Ed, things like that. And then, of course, emergency vehicles. There are no scenarios within the Open Streets program that do not allow for emergency access. That is really a paramount concern of ours, as well as the fire departments. So when you are driving on the block to do any of these activities, you must be cautious and drive 5 miles per hour because, like I mentioned, we really want to make sure that these are corridors that are designated for pedestrian and cyclist use and are really prioritizing those road users. In terms of criteria, this type of open street must be multi-blocks. It does also need to be on some sort of recurring regular schedule, at least 2 days a week, and can occur anytime between 8 a.m. and 9 p.m., a minimum of 2 days a week up to 7. For this type of open streets, you may not impact bus or truck routes. Bus routes are definitely not able to be impacted. There's a little bit of flexibility with truck routes if it's a through route versus a local route, and we can have that conversation offline if you're proposing an open street potentially on a truck route. On the screen now is a great photo example of one of our flagship open street sites that is not in the Bronx, but it is in Queens along 34th Avenue in Jackson Heights. This is definitely by far one of our most popular and successful sites that's managed by a neighborhood coalition of volunteers that work really tediously every day to deliver this community amenity for the hundreds of thousands of folks that honestly live along this corridor in Jackson Heights. And as you can see, the street is predominantly being used by pedestrians and cyclists, but there is still some limited vehicle access allowed, like I said, with parking, picking up, dropping off, things like that. So moving on to the temporary full closure, which is the second type of open street that I'll detail now. So when the street is completely closed to vehicle traffic, so that means no vehicles are accessing the block or parking on the block, it does allow for a whole different sort of diversity of different types of uses that can be done on the open street. Sorry about that. This includes outdoor dining, so expanded outdoor dining setups beyond the structures that restaurants might have in the parking lane. We are also encouraging retail and service types of businesses to participate in open streets this year. So you do not only need to be a food service establishment to participate in the temporary full closure. Another element that we're really keenly interested in adding is community programming, adding just regular positive use and free public programming to open streets can definitely be a great asset to add to the vibrancy of the full closure. And at the end of the day, we want these to just be safe places for people to gather. New Yorkers are sort of have embraced open streets as the living room of New York City, and it's really great to see that people are able to come together in this safe way on open streets. So the last items that I'll just mention in terms of background is that you do have to keep a 15-foot emergency lane on the open street temporary full closure when it is in effect. That's to make sure that a fire truck can get through, ambulance, things like that. And this type of open street is also going to be replacing what Open Streets Restaurants was, as well as weekend walks and seasonal streets. There was a few open streets restaurants closures in the Bronx on Alexander Ave, Willis Ave, Johnson Ave, Arthur Ave, maybe one or two more that I can't remember right now. But just so you know, moving forward, that we're not calling the sort of program Open Streets Restaurants anymore, but all of the same great sort of elements that were part of those closures are still able to happen as a part of this type of open street temporary full closure. Moving on to the criteria, if you're interested in applying for this type of open street, we do permit single block open streets, temporary full closures. So you could apply to close a single block through this type, but it still needs to be on some sort of recurring regular schedule. At least 1 day a week commitment is what we're looking for. It can go up to 7 days a week between 10 a.m. and midnight, and bus routes and truck routes are actually able to be impacted with this type of open street, but only on Friday, Saturdays, and Sundays. Bus routes, no flexibility. You may only impact bus routes to the temporary full closure open street on Friday, Saturdays, and Sundays. Truck routes, there is some minimal flexibility that we can have a conversation with you offline about. Here's a great photo example of a weekend walk event that occurred pre-pandemic. So that's why you don't see mask wearing or social distancing, things like that. But I think this photo really captures a great community programming element that people can add to the temporary full closures. We really want people to be creative in how they want to activate and program open streets this year, and doing things like putting out turf for the day, especially in places that don't have access to open space is really a great idea. And this was done on Bedford Avenue in Williamsburg a few years ago. So now I'm going to touch on how to apply for open streets. We're really open to working with all different types of organizations, formal or informal, to host open streets in their community. At the base level, of course, business improvement districts, community-based organizations can apply, but we're also willing to work with groups of businesses or neighbors. So you do not necessarily need to be a group of businesses formally a part of a bid or a merchants association. You can all just be closely connected by the fact that you are neighbors in any given corridor, and one business can then apply to the Open Streets program to close the street for all the other businesses that might be along the corridor. Same thing applies to just a group of neighbors that want to apply and come together to host an open street in their community. They don't need to be a part of a formal entity or a nonprofit. They can sort of just formalize the Jackson Ave Open Streets Coalition and create the open streets from that organization that they form themselves. But regardless, we do ask that whoever is applying to have an open street, that they must have some sort of strong ties to the community where the open street is being proposed. We don't want people from different parts of the city that have no connection to a neighborhood trying to host an open street. It's never really happened before, but I just want to put that out there. So in terms of what is expected of our partners, you really are going to be responsible for the A to Z management of open streets. So this starts with, of course, putting up the barriers that DOT would provide, setting them up at the beginning of the day, making sure that they're staying in place throughout closure, and then taking them down at the end of the day. In some cases, we might ask that you have signs and other items, but we'll let you know about that. But it will be your responsibility to put up the barriers and things like that. And then beyond that, it's also really your role to coordinate all the operations and any programming executed to make sure that open streets are going off without a hitch, no issues or items that need to be addressed. But if there are, you would just work with us to sort of resolve them on the fly. The last two items to keep in mind is that we do have an emergency need to sometimes move barriers, whether that is for a fire truck or if there's a weather emergency, and our partners do have to play a role in making sure that they can help us move or secure those barriers during those times. And the last expectation is that you are going to be responsible for regularly messaging to the public about open streets, just so people know about when the street is closed. We, of course, do our own promotion, but it really helps when, people like yourselves or the organizations that would be hosting these open streets can play a big role in just community outreach and regular messaging, because you all are community champions and have really grassroots local knowledge, and are able to disseminate information at the local level. So it is really important that our partners are doing that as well. Great photo example of a temporary limited local access open street in Fort Greene, Brooklyn. So in terms of applying, there are a few documents that you will need to upload as a part of the application. The first is the site plan, just laying out the emergency lane and the general layout of where things are. That does not need to be to scale. The run a show, just laying out when the street will close, when it'll reopen. The management plan, exactly how you plan to execute your open streets, the outreach plan, how you're going to regularly message the public about open streets. And the last two items are optional, the programming plan and the budget plan. If you are planning to add programming on your open street, you do need to add that. And if you are looking to apply for funding, which the city is still trying to work out the details on, you would upload the budget plan. When you go to the application, you can get a sort of more nuanced details on all of the items that are expected as a part of these application requirements, but that is the basic overview. So the last section of the deck, before I turn it over to questions, is just talking about eligible activities at open streets, both commercial activity as well as programming. So in terms of commercial activity, of course, outdoor dining is a huge component that is really highly encouraged as a part of open streets. There's so many incidences of restaurants across New York City that say that open streets really has been a lifeline for them. The added capacity and sort of just amenities that open streets bring, it really translates to sales and increased foot traffic to these restaurants. And that's something that these businesses really need at this time. And then the other type of businesses that can participate are those that are predominantly involved in the sale of goods or services to the general public. This is through the Open Storefronts program that many of you might have heard about last fall. We really want to make sure that all businesses along commercial corridors know that there's really opportunities basically almost for everyone to participate in open streets, and we really want to make sure that non-food businesses also know that they have the opportunity to participate in 2021. So last item is just programming. Like I said, we really want to keenly encourage regular positive programming to just add to the vibrant elements of open streets. New York City is a city of neighborhoods, and each of the neighborhoods that we come from really represent and have unique items that are really able to be showcased on open streets. So we really want folks to know that these are assets to sort of just showcase all the great things that make New York City neighborhoods great, and really encourage people to make use of the streets as public space. The last sort of more nuanced, kind of confusing item is our open culture program, which was just released a few weeks ago by the mayor, where eligible cultural institutions can apply to do a street closure, to do ticketed events, performances, things like that. That is a separate program from Open Streets. We're happy to sort of answer any questions about the difference between this programming policy and the Open Culture program, but I just want everyone to know that they are two separate programs. There is Open Culture, and then there is Open Streets. Open Culture can occur on some open streets, but it also is on a lot of other regular streets too. So not every open street is open culture eligible. If there's any questions about that, we're happy to take them at the end. Here's another great photo example of the 34th Avenue open street in Jackson Heights. You can see that there's a yoga class in the background. There's actually an English class happening. There's this obstacle course that was developed by our programming partner, Street Lab. So there's so many vibrant elements that you really can add to open streets. In terms of the policy and just getting this programming on open streets, it does require a permit by SAPO. We'll work with you on that process and sort of guide you through how to do that. There is a little bit of sighting and crowd restrictions that everyone has to keep in mind. As the city continues to recover and reopen from the pandemic that we've all been living through, a lot of these items will probably change. But just note that we will have to work with the Street Activity Permit Office to do any programming on open streets. So if there's a performance, if there's an arts and crafts station, if there's a yoga class, anything beyond outdoor dining or open storefronts requires a permit by SAPO. So that actually concludes my presentation. But before I wrap up, I just want to let everyone know that they should feel free to visit nyc.gov Open Streets, which is the official webpage for the program, where you can find out more information about the program, including the application and getting more into the nuanced details of everything that I have described. You can also get more information about where existing open streets are and when they operate. If you have any questions, you can feel free to, of course, always reach out to our Bronx Borough Commissioner's office or email the program director, me, directly at openstreets@dot.nyc.gov. And we're happy to answer any questions you have or discuss any proposals. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. And if it sounds good to everyone, I'll take questions.
Thank you, Def, for the presentation. I just wanted to ask to start off the questions, and as I'm speaking, everyone else can sort of get themselves acclimated and ready to unmute themselves and all that good stuff. I just always feel a little more comfortable when I see Bronx imagery in presentations, and so I'm not sure why there wasn't any included in the presentation. Is it that they're not these? I mean, obviously it's happening. It just felt a little bit like, how do we know what it looks like where we are? So is there something about it that's not happening in the Bronx the way it should, or is that an indication
I totally
that that's not
apologize.
happening?
That was completely an oversight. This is just a citywide deck that I've been sort of just running around to all the borough service cabinets and various webinars. We're happy to put together a sort of shorter deck of some photos of successful Bronx sites to share with you if you'd like.
Well, we on the mainland, we get to be a little bit, selfish, so we like to see ourselves, in the program. But other than that, I'll just ask, are there any hands raised, Chris, for questions?
Not at the moment. George briefly rose his hand. Oh, all right, so it's all changing very quickly. George, I did see your hand first, and it's up now. So go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's my confusion on my part with the hand thing. Good morning. I read this morning and I was looking for it and I just couldn't see it. It wasn't in the Bronx. It was maybe in Brooklyn or Queens, an organization that was looking for the Open Streets program. And DOT has multiple programs because they have the pedestrian plazas as well. Is there a cost associated with this that is prohibitive for organizations? I mean, there are a lot of planning, which seems like you would have to hire a professional to draw plans, maybe even insurance requirements. How does that stuff work out for you guys? How do you guys work that out?
So we don't actually require insurance for open streets. So partners do not need to secure insurance to participate in the program. But it really does rely a lot on the partners to sort of coordinate the operational details. We're happy to work with any community-based organization as they put these plans together. And like I had mentioned in the presentation, we are really actively trying to identify as many resources as we possibly can to support all communities across the city as they attempt to execute open streets. The mayor just recently announced the Cleanup Corps opportunity that many of you might have already heard about. And a certain amount of personnel is actually going to be earmarked for open streets moving forward. So we're hoping to have that to be invested, especially in the hardest hit communities by COVID. And in addition to that, we're hoping to also have ideally some funding that we can directly provide to partners if they do need to hire personnel, pay for programming, things like that.
Is there a cost associated with this
No, there's no cost.
Okay.
I mean, there's no cost leveraged by the city. We don't charge any fees or anything like that.
Okay. You don't recall, again, I just saw it this morning and I've been looking at Gotham Gazette, all the things that I get.
It's in the city. I think I know what you're talking about. It's in the city. It was about Sunset Park. Yeah.
You're on mute, George.
Oh, why is Sunset Park complaining about fees associated with it? What am I missing from that article?
I think that article was more about funding for partners and not necessarily about fees being leveraged. There was, I know, also some other, and I don't exactly remember which outlet it was from, but there was some concerns by restaurants about fees that they were receiving when they're in violation of various, guidance that we are, some are, under the control of the city, but many of this is also, issued by the state, and it's up to the city to enforce on a lot of this. So there are some, I think fines that the restaurants are annoyed by, but we all have to follow the rules to a degree.
Thank you, sir.
George, could you share that with Marisol so that that article can be shared with the group? It sounds very interesting. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, I did see, well, Ralph Acevedo's hand is still up. So Ralph, go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. I have two questions here. My first question is regarding the strong community ties. Is that something like a letter of support from the community board, or what kind of proof are you looking for with the community ties? My second question is regarding the eligibility, a new category, the group of neighbors. What is that? Like homeowners? What constitutes group of neighbors, and what would be the purpose of them applying? Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Great questions. Both of those items are pretty loosely defined. The groups of neighbors is just, it doesn't necessarily need to be homeowners. It can be neighbors. It can be someone who owns a business and neighbors. It really doesn't, there's no sort of criteria that we have there. A lot of independent coalitions have formed around the city on like 34th Avenue in Jackson Heights, Berry Street in Brooklyn, Avenue B in Manhattan, where people have come together that are just all from the same community to manage this open street. And in terms of buy-in, there's no sort of formal resolution or anything that we're looking for. I think it's definitely always ideal to have community support and community board support and buy-in, as well as just sort of locals on the street that maybe aren't at the community board. But we don't have any specific minimum sort of requirement there. It's pretty loosely defined.
All right, and then I did see a couple other hands briefly. I'm not sure if they still want to ask a question, but Ken, I'd seen your hand up. Did you have something?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. The only thing I wanted clarification on is, does the hosting organization or group that are making the petition, do they have any responsibility to provide restrooms or access to water or any kind of infrastructure that's going to be required?
No, we do not require that.
Okay.
All right, one more hand that I see that just went up. Reshma, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation, Kyle. I just had a brief question. You brought up how, in terms of programming, the open culture program and the open street program might sometimes intersect. So can you speak a little bit more on that? Does that also include like religious programming can also be available for the open street program? Like, can you just speak a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so open culture is a separate program that's specific for institutions that like a performance venue or a concert hall or something like that wants to offer a ticketed event on these streets that are designated open culture. So they can charge for tickets. it can be only open to those people that are paying to sit in the seat there and things like that. So that's a separate program from Open Streets. Open Streets has its own programming policy with the Street Activity Permit Office, which is based at a city hall that has, jurisdiction over all activity that happens on New York City streets, like street fairs, block parties, things like that. And we're working with them so they can also permit any types of activities that happen on open streets. So if there was a religious entity that wanted to add programming on open streets, or a nonprofit, we've worked with senior centers, we've worked with cooling centers, summer camps have popped up on open streets, including in the Bronx. So it's there's a lot of millions of opportunities. The thing that you need to do is just get the SAPO permit, and then you're good to go. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. I just have a follow-up question. What if, in terms of the programming, if there's remnants of the programming, so like say there's trash, or if it was, for example, a Hindu program like that I can think of would be like Holi or Pagwa, and that involves like a lot of throwing of colored powder. And what if that happened in the Bronx, and there needs to be a cleanup that happens afterward? Is the cleanup predominantly a responsibility for the organizers, or can they get assistance from city partners?
For those types of events that are being coordinated by independent entities, they are going to be responsible for reverting the street back to its condition before. But I really would defer to SAPO on that, because they have a whole slew of experience working a lot more in these more unique situations like you just described.
Thank you.
All right, John Dudley, I saw your hand next.
No problem. Thank you very much. Let me just ask you, and I know you mentioned about the application requirements, you mentioned about the site plan, the run of show, the management plan, outreach plan, and all those related application requirements. Would the sponsor applicant submit, and just like we have regular street closing permits that are submitted now via SAPO, that the community board plays a role in approving, as well as the office of the mayor, the street activity permits office, would these applications be subject to review and approval by the community board?
At this time,
Maybe I missed it.
yeah, at this time, the review process is by city agencies, and then we'll notify community boards about the status of the open street. But we really do highly encourage our community partners to work directly with community boards as they develop their plans, before executing, during execution, and things like that.
Okay, so the applications, for all intent and purposes, have to be submitted to SAPO. They are reviewed by a collaboration of the city agencies, I guess, as part of the review process, but not community boards. But you encourage them to reach out to the boards, or at least make the boards aware of their application and the intent and the overall programming intent of for the day, at least, right?
So yeah, so the role that community boards would be able to play in a sort of reviewing applications is actually on programming. So you only get a SAPO permit if you're doing programming. So if you're doing a performance, if you're doing a salsa class, if you're doing arts and crafts, just like anytime the SAPO permits go to each of the community boards for their review in NYPD, that's when the community boards would get to sort of offer their feedback on. For the individual open streets application, we don't actually have a formal process set up. We're working towards what the permanent program is going to look like, but for now, it's just this interagency review, and then we encourage our partners to work with the community boards.
Okay, so finally then, just as if there is a programming element, that's when SAPO gets involved, right?
Exactly.
In that, other than that, it's submitted through your site. In other words, if there's an applicant that wanted to submit an application for this, they would just submit it directly to you, or not SAPO per se, unless there's a programming element.
Exactly. Like a good example of it is Arthur Avenue. So the bid is going to apply to close Arthur Avenue, and it's predominantly just for them to have their like piazza style dining with all of the restaurants. Now, if the bid wanted to add in a performance, if they wanted to add in COVID testing, if they wanted to add arts and crafts, whatever, then they would apply to have the SAPO permit, and that would go to each individual board for their review, as well
Okay,
as
and the last comment I would have, it's interesting that there's no liability insurance element related to this, especially when you get the temporary closures. There's a lot of activity, you got pedestrians, you got cyclists, you got pickups, deliveries, all of that, so vehicles that are allowed in there. I'm just saying that may or may not be an issue, at some point related to some activities or events. It's just something, it's interesting that there's no liability, because at the end of the day, if someone does get hurt for whatever reason, whose liability would it be? Would it be the city's?
The city does not indemnify community partners of any and all liabilities, so it's has not happened yet, knock on wood. But it's possible that both of our partners and the city could be named in any lawsuit or something like that. But a lot of organizations do carry their own insurance for this type of thing. It's something that we really encourage them to still do. And also, one thing to note is that certain types of programming elements, like for example, a bouncy castle, SAPO is never going to allow a bouncy castle on a New York City street without the vendor providing
Insurance of zone.
Exactly, yeah.
Thank you, William. Thank you.
Thank you.
So no bouncy castles.
You can have one. Well, the bouncy castles are interesting because that's the one time when like a partner doesn't need insurance, the vendor actually would need to carry insurance. But that's a SAPO thing more.
Any other hands, Chris?
Nope, that's it for now, as far as I see.
Well, I for one am disappointed about the bouncy castle, but I'll get over it.
Well, we'll try to make it happen. We'll try.
That's what I'd like to hear. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you again for the presentation, and thank you for being with us this morning. I'm sure we'll have much contact with you in your office in the future because, we have a lot of questions. So
Thank you all so much for having me. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. So our next presentation is coming from both the city Department of City Planning and MTA, New York City Transit. We're going to be talking about elevated transit zoning for accessibility for informational purposes. I have a list of a lot of folks, so I'm not exactly sure who will begin the presentation, but what I will do is I'll ask everyone to introduce themselves as they begin their presentation. And if you have a slideshow, which I'm sure you do, to start it whenever you're ready. Thank you.
Great. So I'll go ahead and start. And Angela, if you want to put the slideshow on while I'm setting up the introduction. Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you all. I'm Jatan Horstman. I'm a senior planner with the Department of City Planning in the Bronx office. Today, we'll be presenting on a proposed zoning text amendment called Zoning for Accessibility, a citywide zoning proposal to create more opportunities that increase accessibility in the transit system. We're here to speak with you about a proposal that is focused on increasing physical accessibility to New York City's transit system and using zoning as one tool to do that. This proposal is a joint effort between the MTA, City Planning, and the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities, and which builds off a report produced by the New York City Council's office. The proposal that you'll hear takes the form of a zoning text amendment, which, as many of you know, is essentially an update to the rules of the zoning resolution. The proposal does have citywide implications, and because of this, it was referred to every community board in the city on April 5th. I'm joined by Christopher Lee, co-project manager, with Angela Blicio, also co-project manager, and who will be presenting the second half, and James Harris from our governmental affairs division in the city planning, as well as Charvis Gonzalez, Luke DePalma, and Howie Levine from the MTA. And so I'm actually going to turn it over to Howie from the MTA to help us walk through the background on the proposal. And then Angela will explain the zoning proposal portion in the second half. And then we'll take questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks for your time. Can everyone hear me, see me all right?
Yes, we can hear you, Howie.
Yep. Perfect. Thanks. So if we can go to the next slide, Angela. So as Jutan kind of set up, just to give a high-level overview of what this is, kind of in black and white on this slide, Zoning for Accessibility is a joint initiative between the MTA, Department of City Planning, as well as the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. It's a zoning text amendment. It's going to allow the MTA to work more efficiently with private developers to help us achieve system-wide accessibility much more quickly. And so there's two parts to this proposal. The first is a system-wide transit easement requirement, and the second is an expanded transit improvement bonus in certain high-density areas. We'll get into more details on both of those in a minute. So, next slide. So, right now, as I think many people are aware, the MTA is not fully accessible. Many, if not most, of our stations were built before 1950 without the thought to vertical accessibility and elevators in stations. And so right now, 136 of our 493 subway and SER stations are currently accessible, which is about 28% of the system. On our commuter railroads, which this proposal would also apply to, 25 out of 39 of our stations within city limits are currently accessible, so a little better. And of course, when we talk about ADA accessible stations, there's a whole host of different features and different changes we make to make sure they're fully accessible. But this proposal, we are focusing on vertical accessibility and mobility accessibility. Next slide, Angela. So just to put, more specific, when we talk about accessibility, most people were talking about, most people are thinking of folks with mobility disabilities, and they're a huge part of this. But there also are a number of other communities who really need accessibility to use our transit system. That include parents with young children, our senior population, which continues to grow, actually growing at twice the rate of our overall population growth. Of course, also people with temporary injuries, and really anyone for whom having an elevator at the station would just provide a much more convenient and accessible ride on the transit system. And for some of these communities, there's just no choice in the matter. And so a subway ride that for many people can take just a few minutes ends up taking a few hours and following a much more circuitous route. Go to the next slide. So with that in mind, the MTA has made a historic commitment to accessibility in our most recent capital plan. In our 20 to 24 capital plan, we've committed $5 billion, over $5 billion to make 77 stations accessible. The end goal with this plan is that once it's completed, no subway rider will be more than 2 stations away from an accessible station. And on the right in the image, we have a new elevator that just opened at our Bedford Park Boulevard station on the B and the D train. That was part of our last capital program, but this is the type of improvements we're envisioning for the Bronx through our capital plan. Next slide, Angela. So even with this historic funding commitment, building elevators is extremely challenging. We have a number of different factors that make it costly, time-consuming, and very complicated. So just a few I'll highlight. On the right, we have narrow platforms. We have narrow sidewalks on that top right picture, and particularly the narrow clearance between some of our elevated stations and the buildings that have gone up around them. And so there's really just, in some places, no space to even add an elevator to the sidewalk to help make that station accessible. And we kind of have very complicated plans for how we could possibly do that, but there's some tools in zoning for accessibility that would make that much easier. And of course, on the bottom, underground infrastructure, I think as anyone who ever has tried to almost build on anything under the ground in New York City knows, there's just decades and decades of highly complex infrastructure, and relocating it is incredibly costly. And sometimes, you have a map of what you expect to be under there, and you open up a sidewalk and it's completely different. And you have to kind of go back to the drawing board, and those type of problems add a lot of cost, a lot of inconvenience and hassle to a project, and just keep us farther and farther from system-wide accessibility. And so with these problems in mind, right now we do have zoning regulations that help us get to a more accessible system and just create transit improvements in our system overall. So for example, on the right here is an easement, which is a space in a private building that is set aside for the MTA to have a station access point. So in this example, in Manhattan on the 28th Street station, and we don't have many examples of these in our system. If there had more in the Bronx, I'd hopefully show you a picture of one in the Bronx, and that's what we're trying to address with this proposal. But at this one, you can see there's an elevator on the left here, and there's a staircase on the right, and both of those have been moved off of this sidewalk, create a better sidewalk environment, and also help us create better configured station and more direct accessible routes within the station, so it's not so so indirect, such a long path between once you get down an elevator and then getting to the platform. So with the easements that I've mentioned specifically, these are providing a space in a developer's building near transit stations is the most simple definition. So on the right here, you have an image from Brooklyn where you can see that we have this elevated platform there, and then a large building that has just gone up right next to the transit station, where it would have been the perfect place for us to have sited an elevator to make that platform accessible. But unfortunately, there's some limitations on these provisions right now. There is essentially no general framework for facilitating them outside of very specific areas in Manhattan, predominantly around the future areas where there'll be Second Avenue subway stations, and in limited areas in the recently rezoned Inwood Special Zoning District. And so as a result, there's many missed opportunities for this, and as a result, we need to find more complicated, less direct places to put our elevators to make these stations accessible. And so if we go to the next slide, the other existing zoning regulation that we're talking about, we're going to modify with zoning for accessibility, is the transit bonus mechanism, which allows developers a voluntary program to earn up to 20% FAR bonus in exchange for building significant station improvements themselves. So in contrast to the easement, where the developer sets aside the space in the building and the MTA comes and builds the improvement later, in these cases with the bonus mechanism, the developer actually builds those improvements themselves in exchange for that transit bonus. So right now, this is only available in the highest density parts of the city, at stations that are highlighted in blue on this map on the right. It's also only available to development sites that are adjacent to transit stations, so it's very limited to what sites are able to use this. And the current application process has a lot of time and risk to development schedule. It's actually a full ULURP application to use this, and so as a result, even though we've had this on the books for many decades, we've had less than a dozen stations actually benefit from this program. So the next slide. So with these issues in mind, both the lack of accessibility in our transit system and how our existing zoning tools that we've created to help address that have proven not quite adequate to help us meet that need. That's kind of the premise under which we're introducing this proposal, zoning for accessibility. And I'm going to turn it over to DCP to talk through more of the details of that proposal. And Angela, for me, the mute button's on the very bottom. I'm not sure where it is for you when you're screen sharing.
Yeah, here, let me, if you guys are done with the slideshow, I'll just change the presenter role back to me. That'll
Chris,
eliminate
I apologize, we're actually not done with the slideshow. DCP is
Sorry.
going to speak to it, but I think was having trouble finding the mute button while screen
Yeah, but-
sharing.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Let me
yeah.
try again.
Okay.
The
Yeah.
bottom bar went away.
Yeah, WebEx moves it into like all these different little boxes,
Yeah.
and the menu is totally different. So yeah, if that makes it easier, there we go.
All right. Oh, a minute. Now you have all of my notes open as well, don't you?
We do, although I don't think it's such an issue for the moment, but if you want to make that full screen, that would probably be great.
Is that? Are you seeing the whole? Are you seeing the presentation now?
Seeing the presentation on the left half of the screen.
I'm sorry. I have not mastered WebEx. I apologize.
Yeah, I mean, with it just on the left side of the screen, I could see it. I'm not sure if others, and we probably need to zoom in on some of the maps in later slides, but
I'm not
in general,
sure.
it was readable.
Right. I'm not sure why it's doing that. I
Yeah, I
apologize.
think it's good to continue with this.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. Hi, I'm Angela Felicio from the Department of City Planning. And I will go through the sort of specifics of our proposal. As Howie mentioned, the first component of this proposal is a system-wide easement requirement. And that would address some of the limitations that he had gone through concerning the existing easement provisions today. So as part of this requirement, all developments and enlargements on zoning lots that are within 50 feet of mass transit stations and in applicable zoning districts would need to file for an application with the MTA and the chairperson of the City Planning Commission to determine whether an easement on a zoning lot is needed to help facilitate station access improvements in the future. Applicable zoning districts are residence districts that support multifamily apartment buildings, and also medium and high density commercial and all manufacturing districts. And these districts are generally more compatible with transit station entrances and other transit related uses. While the process of obtaining a certification would be required for most sites within 50 feet of a transit station, it's anticipated that the MTA will only ask for easements in limited places that are the most optimal for siting a future entrance. And we have some maps, Bronx specific maps later on in the presentation, but in terms of the easement requirement, this would be applicable to all stations in the Bronx except for 3. And those are Baychester on the 5, Pelham Parkway on the 5, and also Riverdale, which is a Metro North rail station. And the reason that those 3 stations would not be applicable in this easement requirement is they are surrounded by residence districts that are below the R5 threshold, so lower density residential districts. Oops. So the transit agency, the MTA, in consultation with both the developer and the chairperson of the City Planning Commission, would work together to determine the necessary easement for a future station. And this conversation would be dependent on the needs of the individual station and sort of the aspects of the transit easement. And so those transit easements could vary in shape and size, sort of depending on each individual circumstance. In terms of sort of the vertical element of the station, this would depend on whether it is an underground station or an elevated station. And so if it's an underground subway station, this easement might occupy multiple floors below grade. An elevated transit station, an easement that is associated with an elevated transit station could take up multiple floors above grade. And also, horizontally, the easement, can vary depending on the sort of type of access that is needed. So, if you have just an easement that will house just an elevator, that will take up less space, whereas, a station entrance that needs, an elevator and a staircase and a turnstile would have a larger horizontal footprint to accommodate that easement. And we're also taking into consideration that there could be other scenarios. It is possible that the MTA will have other station needs, including something like a substation, and that might have, a sort of larger easement volume, but that would be entirely in the cellular level of the development site. And so because of these different, sort of easement sizes, the easement areas can affect the development in a number of ways. The easement itself takes up floor space in a site, and that can reduce the floor area of a development itself. The shape and size of an easement can occupy a large amount of space within the building envelope, and this affects the area that is occupied by the easement, but also has sort of implications for the construction feasibility around the easement area. Easements can also restrict available space to provide ground floor uses and parking spaces. And depending on the type of development, they may create compatibility uses with sort of more sensitive uses such as apartments and other residential uses. And so without any easement, without any zoning relief, easements could then limit construction of a development to its full potential. And additionally, it could, an easement could result in a building that, sort of lacks a relationship with its surrounding area. So in order to facilitate these easement agreements, we are also proposing targeted relief. And this will minimize the potential challenges for construction on a site. And so we are highlighting 5 general categories of provisions. And they are floor area and open space provisions. And those would ensure the accommodation of an easement does not reduce development potential and would allow for greater flexibility of locating an easement on a development site. We're looking at height and setback modifications, and these would be provided to facilitate the accommodation of all permitted floor area to a space, offering parking relief, and that would address the potential limitations, created by an easement to provide required parking. Use allowances would be made to support compatible uses around the station entrances, and finally, streetscape provisions, and that would ensure that developments are appropriately designed around future station entrances. And that would also seek to sort of minimize the conflict between the transit users that are entering and leaving a station and automobile traffic that might also be in the same area. So the second component of this proposal is an expanded transit bonus program. And this would be optional for sites that are near a transit station. This would grant a floor area bonus of up to 20% for a significant station improvement. And because of as Howie had mentioned, the limited applicability of this program and the lengthy application process needed to obtain a bonus currently, there have only been, as Howie mentioned, a handful of station improvements that have used this tool up to date. And so to address that, our proposed transit bonus program would continue to grant a floor area bonus of up to 20% of a floor area ratio for developments and enlargements that construct station improvements. But it would expand the geography of areas of where this transit bonus may be used. Additionally, the floor area bonus would be subject to a simplified discretionary review and approval in the form of an authorization by the City Planning Commission. And as I mentioned, it is only for a significant station improvement. And such improvements may vary and include, a variety of station upgrades. First off, where a station is inaccessible, ADA upgrades would be prioritized. So in a non-accessible station, a vertical accessibility improvement and elevator would be required to be added to the station first. And then the amount of floor area that you receive from the bonus is contingent to the degree on how much improvements enhance the station environment. And so there would have to be some kind of proportionality between the amount of additional floor area granted and the station improvements that were provided. And additionally, the floor area generated from this bonus can only be occupied when the MTA determines that such improvements are usable by the public. In the Bronx, we have just a few areas that would be applicable for the transit bonus. There are areas around 149th Street and Grand Concourse on the 245, areas around 161st Street at Yankee Stadium, which is the 4, the B, and the D, the 167th Street on the 4, and also one Metro North station at Yankee East, 153rd Street. So again, we have some maps so you can sort of explain these moving forward. But just so, in terms of scope, the bonus would not be available to every station in the Bronx, but only the ones in the high density areas. And this is the slide sort of explains the reason. So this new bonus program would expand the applicability of the existing subway bonus program to high density areas and key business districts in Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, and the Bronx. As how I mentioned earlier, the existing subway bonus program only applies to transit adjacent sites in the highest commercial districts. The proposed bonus would expand this geography to other high density areas, including all R9 and R10 districts in the city, their commercial equivalents, and M16 districts. And it would also allow sites that are within 500 feet of a station to participate in the program in exchange for an offsite improvement that could be constructed at a station that is not immediately adjacent to the site. Within central business districts in Manhattan and Brooklyn and the Bronx and Queens, offsite improvements could be provided within 1,500 feet of the development site. And so we think this new feature of this bonus program, which allows both on-site and off-site improvements, will incentivize a greater number of developments to provide station improvements. So as a quick summary of what I just went through, the Zoning for Accessibility proposes a zoning text amendment to establish a framework for coordinating the siting and provision of transit station improvements with new developments on adjacent sites. As part of this framework, there's a required consultation process that would apply to all developments and enlargements on zoning lots within 50 feet of a mass transit station and in applicable zoning districts. Where easements are needed, we are offering targeted relief from certain zoning limits for sites. In addition to this proposed relief, there's further use bulk parking, loading, and streetscape modifications that could also be available pursuant to an additional discretionary review and approval. And in addition to the system-wide easement framework, this text amendment would also include an expanded transit bonus program. This would continue to grant a floor area bonus of up to 20% of the maximum floor area for developments and enlargements that construct station improvements, but would expand the geography of where the areas that the transit bonus may be used. And so that concludes our presentation. I have, as I mentioned, a couple of Bronx-specific maps to sort of help you understand how this impacts you that I can pull up as needed as we go through questions. But I think it is appropriate now to open to questions. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you unshare, or do you need to?
Oh yeah, no, I
right.
took care of it. I switched the role, so we're good.
Okay. All right, awesome. Thank you for the presentation. Obviously, a lot of information. So, any questions? Just raise your hands virtually. And if you're on the phone, *9. And any questions, Chris? People are probably processing all of the information, so we should give them a few seconds to process. Take a couple of Zen deep breaths.
Yeah, they're coming in now. Laura Spalter, I saw you first, so go ahead, Laura. Just remember to unmute, please.
I'm foolish. Thank you. My understanding.
Well, it's easier to answer your question if you're on mute, but if you know.
My understanding is that our subway, the #1 train at Broadway and 242nd Street in Community Board 8, is already in the city's capital budget for an elevator already. Does this program impact that project in any way with something that's already in the pipeline?
No, so I can take that, Laura. So generally, if something's already in the capital plan, that's going to be moving forward as it would otherwise. You know, if we, in the future, if we already have an easement, or if we know an easement under this program is, you know, kind of being built out as we speak, we may wait for that to be finished so we can build the elevator in that easement, because that would be much easier and provide a better, kind of streetscape experience for everyone using that station, or just, using the sidewalk around that station. So we might, in that circumstance, change our plans a little bit, but generally it's not going to delay our work or anything like that on our current capital project commitments. No.
Thank you. Good.
All right, John Dudley, I see your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, for a property owner who may have an architect and who is submitting a new building application for a particular location that is adjacent, within the 50-foot requirement or otherwise for the zoning for access. Once ZFA is implemented as a zoning text amendment, and a property owner wants to develop, because I know you mentioned about the requirements for consultations, I guess, with the Department of City Planning and with the MTA, right? What is the flag? What methodology is going to be for that individual? Would he know when he wants to develop that there is now a requirement because of the proximity to that station? And what process is he to be made aware of that he must then follow by way of the consultations and what comes thereafter?
Howard, do you want to grab that? Should I?
Sure, I can take that. So generally speaking, and then DC can fill in any details I might miss, when someone goes to file building permits with the Department of Buildings, it would be flagged by the Department of Buildings that they're within 50 feet of a transit station envelope, and they'd be asked to talk with the MTA and the Department of City Planning and have us certify that we do not or do need an easement on their building site. And so this kind of process of DOB flagging buildings actually currently exists. DOB flags any building right now within a much broader range. It's 200 feet, just to see if there's any impact on MTA infrastructure overall, which we want to avoid. I think everyone wants to avoid. And so this would be similar to that, but more narrow within that 50 feet. And as Angela mentioned, in most cases, it probably is not necessarily going to make sense for us to take a transit or to use a transit easement space within this building. There's only, our stations are all unique, development sites are all unique. We're hoping that we'll be able to make it work at a number of stations at certain sites, but that doesn't mean every site is going to be the solution for us. But in general, that's kind of the way the flagging process works.
Okay, so then they're flagged when they submit the application to speak to MTA and DCP, and then based upon those consultations, there's a determination then made by DCP and MTA that an easement is going to be needed for that development at that point, and then that would subsequently affect the nature of the plans that are likely to be submitted. That's what I just want to know.
I can go through it more thoroughly. So generally, the MTA, through this program, there's a clock we have given ourselves that we have 60 days, and if we don't respond in 60 days, continue developing as if it didn't ever happen. But we're hoping to respond much more quickly in most cases that we probably don't need one. But in cases where we do need an easement and the station's not accessible, we think this is actually a great place for us to put in an elevator that will make that station accessible. Then we would kind of notify the building owner of that need. We kind of give parameters of what kind of size and shape easement we would need in the building. And then we generally leave it up to the building architect to kind of fit that into the building however they best want to, with those parameters in mind. And then they would come back to us with a building plan with that incorporated. And then we would have a certain number of days to comment on it, and continue our conversation, reach a conclusion, talk about the zoning relief that Angela mentioned briefly, that help where they can use that space that would be used for the easement elsewhere on their development site. things of that nature as well.
And thank you so much for that. And lastly, the relief. In other words, when that is done and they incorporate that as part of the design and their plan submission, and that then would be approved, I guess, by DCP and MTA, their plans before submission. The relief that would be afforded to that property owner, would that be a relief that is commensurate with the I'm not going to, maybe I could say FAR, or the amount of space that would be consumed by the infrastructure that would be incorporated either within the building envelope itself or within the site at large for the purposes of accessibility? Would that space, or would that aggregate square footage of a sort, for lack of a better word, would that be the relief that will be passed on to the owner for the development purposes related either to the building itself or to site or to site enlargement or height or other? Is that how it works? It's like a trade-off. In other words, do they get that additional bonus?
Yeah, so that's more or less, pretty close to exactly correct. That when, say the MTA would need an easement that's 100 square feet, then as a result, the developer would be able to use 100 square feet elsewhere in their building. And so that's why there's certain relief in terms of kind of a height limitation if it needs to go on top of the building, or it could go elsewhere. That's where those more targeted relief. So there is that kind of floor area provision, and then the other broad things that we're talking about, parking, open space, streetscape, are all more to when the easement space that is in the building kind of makes the compliance with those requirements difficult, that we provide some relief. So, it's not this easement that the city has asked you to provide, and as a result, you're really struggling to find a place in your building to put all those required parking spots. We'd be able to grant you some relief from something like that, if that makes sense.
And the relief that then would be afforded, it still would be within the context of the existing zoning regulations. In other words, it wouldn't be anything out of context with what would ordinarily be permitted as a right.
Yeah, correct. And so that's the reason why we talk about it kind of a high level, because it's different in each specific zoning district across the Bronx, depending on what the requirements are.
Thanks a lot, Howie. Thank you.
All right, George Torres, I saw your hand next. Go ahead, George.
Hey, hey, how you doing? So my concern extends to the fact that those of us that are in transit-rich districts, we already had, when Mayor de Blasio became the mayor, increased FAR because of the zoning that he did when he first became the mayor. You may or may not recall that most of the Bronx community boards voted against that rezoning because of the requirements on parking. You're now stating, if I understand it correctly, that they can increase the FAR even beyond what was specified in that, if they have to do, because actually in my community board 12, we have the Enclave development, which was at 241st Street and White Plains Road, and they actually got caught on this issue. And the developer was actually going to walk away from the project. And actually, I kind of don't even remember. I do recall having conversations with HPD, because the requirement for them to put the elevator was cost prohibitive for them. They were losing a significant number of housing or apartments within that line. And it's a very narrow walkway. Ultimately, I think the MTA walked away from their commitment to require them to build the elevator. I'm just curious because, again, one of the provisions we did not like about the transit-rich upzoning, if you will, was the lack of parking. Even in the outer boroughs, even if you live on a transit line, people still own vehicles. They still travel. Right now, it's not even at 50%. And now it seems like we're even requiring less parking, or that may be an alternative. And the final thing that I'll state, although I may not necessarily agree with it, increasing the FAR so that they can go upwards may actually kind of turn some people off too. I mean, a lot of people in my community board are anti-development. So if you're building bigger and bulkier, there are not a lot of people, and I'm only speaking for my board. My chairman is here, and I'm sure he'll speak for himself, that are against this. We have a lot of development that's happening right now on Tilden Avenue in my area, and people that live in high-rise buildings, 32-story buildings, are complaining about 6- and 7-story buildings being built right next door to them because it's too tall, which is kind of absurd. But in any event, that's what we're dealing with and contending with right now. So the idea that you're increasing or you're allowing developers, especially in transit-rich districts, because this only applies to transit-rich districts, that you're giving them even more FAR to build bigger. So it just seems a little bizarre, but that's my piece on it.
Hi, everybody. George, thank you for your question. I'm Chris Lee from the Zoning Division. These are very good questions, by the way. I just wanted to clarify that the easement provisions, which will apply to most transit stations in the Bronx, will not give a floor area bonus. I mean, that's not it. What's actually happening?
Oh, I misunderstood. Sorry.
No worries. It's zoning is complex. There's a lot that's going on. So I apologize that, there's just so much that's packed in one presentation. But what we're doing with the easements is that if a developer goes through the process and the MTA and the chair of the City Planning Commission determines that this site has to provide an easement, within that easement volume, we are exempting floor area because in the future, the MTA will be using that easement volume for station access, right? They will be inserting an elevator or, accessibility improvements, essentially. And we don't want the developers to lose that floor area that will be given to the MTA. So that's really the crux of it. It's really to it's not a floor area bonus, it's just exempting that area of the easement from zoning floor area calculation. And then the rest of the relief that is being provided through the easement certification is to allow for that space that is being used for the easement volume to be accommodated elsewhere. Easement volumes can vary again, and as Angela pointed out, can vary in shape and size. Sometimes it may create problems for parking and the ability to fit their floor area. So we took all that into consideration when we were crafting the relief. Parking was particularly very tricky for us because you're right, we don't want to necessarily say that the provision easement will exempt everybody from requiring parking. What we want to do, what we're trying to accomplish here in our parking relief is to make sure that the impact of the easement itself on parking is related to the relief. So the degree in which we are providing parking relief is directly tied to the impact of the easement itself. So there's two different types of parking relief that we're proposing. One is a deduction of 15 parking spaces. That is very much a reasonable amount of parking spaces that could be affected when you provide an easement on a site. But for very small sites, what we've noticed is that that there is a struggle to provide for parking and the easements, and we don't necessarily want parking to affect the ability of a site to provide for that easement and a future station access point. So what we're doing there is we are waiving parking for sites that provide an easement that are either below 10,000 square feet or 15,000 square feet. Does that clarify your?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess my final question, if they go upwards, what are the impacts on light and air for some of these developments? Are they going to be able to meet building standards?
So we have two, it depends. So we have, for contextual districts and buildings that are subject to maximum building height limits, they can either get a 10-foot height increase or a 20-foot height increase. It really depends on whether that site is right next to an elevated station or a below grade underground subway station. We did the environmental review. We analyzed different prototypes in the environmental review, and there's a negative declaration that was issued for that because, yeah, we did analyze shadows and we didn't analyze sunlight sensitive resources in the environmental review. So,
all right, thank you.
And Chris was very encyclopedic, I'd say, in that answer. But just one more thing I want to be explicit about is, so there are two pieces of this. The easement is available in every community board in the Bronx, and the bonus is only available in community boards 1 and 4. So just wanted to be explicit about that.
All right. I did see one more question pop up just now. Michael Burke, go ahead.
Hi, how are you doing? This is Dr. Michael Burke, Chairman of Community Board 12. And so I think the district manager asked some great questions. So I just want to make sure I get clarity. When we say that we're offering relief and we're saying that we're going to make it up elsewhere, that was somewhat nebulous to me. So define elsewhere, because I thought that I heard we're going to eliminate some parking, which of course that's problematic for us in our community board anyway, with the quote unquote upzoning that took place a couple of years ago. So where is this relief? If you're giving some relief for an easement, where, you know, the district manager asked a valid question. So where is it being made up? I'm hearing, well, you know, you can go up, but now you're saying, well, no, that's not the case. So where is the relief coming from?
I can answer that question. So it's really to provide, and again, mind you, this is a citywide text amendment. So there's so many different cases. We're affecting a lot of zoning districts and sites that may have different unique site conditions. So I mean, you can look. When I say elsewhere, it's elsewhere on the zoning lot, right? It can either be vertical or it can be horizontal. But there are certain cases for parking where parking is just a site doesn't have the ability to provide for below grade parking because it can be very costly to do that, particularly for small sites. So in that case, we would like to fit floor areas. You know, we would like to provide some flexibility for them to fit floor area on the zoning lot, either 10 or 20 feet, or horizontally on the zoning lot itself.
Okay, thank you. Because I think the one thing that was illustrated, which is true, is that we quite frankly like nice buildings, but we don't necessarily like high buildings, because in our community board, most of the people that reside here are homeowners for the most part. So I think that would be problematic. So that's why I want to make certain that I heard you correctly, when you stated that we can go up. So for instance, if we're in R7 district, you're saying you're going to allot them, if they're on a transit line and they build an easement, you're going to allot them an extra 20 to 30 feet roughly of height. Is that correct?
20, not 30 feet, 20 feet if it's along an elevated rail line. If it's below grade, they only get up to 10 feet.
Okay.
And it's only a height limitation change, not that they are, all of a sudden totally allowed to build, maybe they don't have the FAR to do that. It's more to use that space that's being used by an easement and allow them, if they need to put that on top of the building as it's zoned right now. It's not something where we're saying every building that does this is going to be 10 feet higher or 20 feet higher, depending on exactly the zoning district. It's more, it depends on the easement size and shape and the other kind of issues with the site as well.
And that's actually, to add a little bit to that, an important reason that city planning is doing the reviews of these applications is that we are doing a check of the application and ensure that basically the volume from the easement is only being relocated on the site, and that it's not the applicant trying to use that and get additional volume or just height that doesn't actually relate to the easement. So we are basically cross-checking the work of the applicant and working with the MTA to make sure that it's just the easement volumes.
I'm sorry, I have a follow-up on that point. Are we going to allow self-certification on these NBs then from the buildings department, or you guys are going to double check all that work, which is what you just said?
It always, go ahead, Chris.
So what we're doing through the certification is really determining whether an easement is required or not. The Department of Buildings will, and if they do provide the easements, these relief will be made available to these sites, and the Department of Buildings will look at the relief provisions instead, in tandem with the underlying zoning regulations.
But you're also going to double check once they submit to make sure that they're within the parameters of that easement, because sometimes, you know, they get a little happy with I get YIMBY, and sometimes you see people overbuilding. So are you double checking, or are we allowing buildings to do that process?
We are in close coordination with the Department of Buildings to make sure that they will be looking at these parameters.
Okay.
But our level of review is really making that determination that an easement is necessary on the site, and to look at the easement volume itself. And once the site plan for the easement has been finalized through the certification, then we issue a letter with the MTA to the Department of Buildings saying that this is ready to go through your process, and they will look to see whether they are complying with the underlying zoning provisions as well as the additional relief that's being provided to those sites.
All right, I see one more hand raised, Dr. Bola.
Thank you so much. Well, I recognize the fact that text amendment rezoning is very complex, but a couple of years ago, barely 3 years ago, we had a major rezoning along Jerome Avenue corridor, which of course also extended a little bit west side. I'll give you an example. Please educate me if I'm mistaken, if I'm not getting something right here. We have a location at 1600 Maccombs, which is part of the rezoning R8. Now, that location can only provide about 10 to 15 parking spots for 570 units, because now it's R8. So how does this transit zone rich area and this easement fit into this entire rezoning corridor, especially in line with what you said that Bot 4 had some exception or something, and we are Bot 5, and the entire corridor, you know, affects the whole rezoning, including Bot 4 and Bot 5. I don't know who wants to respond to this question, please.
DCP, Chris, do you want to take just kind of the interactions between
sure.
the Jerome Ave and this program?
I'm not sure which specific project site you are talking about, but if the site is either above 10 or 15,000 square feet, then it would only get a 15 parking space deduction if it is subject to the easement requirement. Are you referring to a project that has not yet been developed yet? Like, have they submitted a buildings application already, or?
Yeah, they're in the process. It's 1600 Maccombs Road, 1600 Maccombs Road.
Okay.
And that site is going to be built for 570 units.
So the easement provisions will only apply to development sites that have not gone through the buildings process yet. So once a project is ready to be developed, if they go to the Department of Buildings to file for an application, then the Department of Buildings will flag that application for the MTA, and they will have to go through the certification process. If this project site is already going through the department buildings already, and if they get approval and their permits from the department buildings before if this text gets adopted by that date, then it will not be subject to the easement certification unless in the future, sometime in the future, if it wants to convert to a different use, we do have optional provisions where in the future, if they think if they would like to provide an easement for the MTA, then they can go through the certification process again.
So they're not likely to be grandfathered in.
Again, if they are already going through the department buildings, if they get their approvals from the department buildings before this zoning for accessibility text that's approved and adopted by city council, then they aren't subject to the easement provisions.
And Dr. Bull, just to add, I mean, as we've kind of talked about a little bit, there's a number of factors that determine whether they're eligible for this, regardless of timing. You know, they have to be within 50 feet of a station envelope. They have to be 5,000 square feet or more to be subject to the requirement. So I'm not sure, you know, we can do some more looking at this site specifically and get back to you on exactly how this proposal would impact that site with the rezoning as well in mind. But, you know, just right off the bat, there are a few requirements that mean that I'm not sure if it's eligible. It may be too far away from a station, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Deputy, I do not see any other questions at this time.
Okay. I guess so, as usual, we give a couple extra minutes just in case another question bubbles up. But as we're doing that, I want to thank everyone for that presentation. There was a lot of content, and I'm sure we'll have additional questions. And as the days, weeks, and months come by, and we'll see you guys again, I'm sure. But thank you again for being with us today. I don't have any other items on the agenda for us. So this is the part when we just ask if there are board members who have announcements that they'd like to make from their board, or some of our audience who are representing agencies who also have things that they would like to announce. We'll give them a time to do that now. So wait a few minutes, let everyone, get themselves together. Raise your hand. Chris will acknowledge you. And if you're on the phone, remember the *9 is the function for raising your hand and being acknowledged on the phone. So Chris, do you see any hands?
Not yet.
Well, it is almost lunchtime, so maybe everyone.
Yeah, I do not see any.
I'm seeing no hands. I want to thank everybody for their time. As always, I want to thank you for your dedication to your community and your community boards specifically. And I wish everyone a very, very happy weekend and happy Mother's Day, because by the time we see you again, we'll be celebrating all the mothers. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. You out.
Everybody, we're live. You got to wait till we're not.